The Promise That Began in Preschool. In the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, nestled among quiet streets and rows of charming houses, there was a cozy preschool that had become a world of wonder for children. The building, painted in soft shades of yellow and blue, had classrooms where the scent of crayons and fresh paper lingered in the air. The walls were adorned with colorful handprints, and the playground was a lively scene of giggles, shouts, and endless games of hide and seek. Every day, the children brought their own stories, their own dreams, and their own little worlds to life. Among the children was 4-year-old Jasmine, a girl with a golden heart and eyes full of curiosity. Her laughter echoed through the playground like a melody, and her boundless energy made her a favorite among the other kids. Jasmine was always in motion, hopping between the swings, climbing the jungle gym, and creating imaginary worlds out of the sandbox. Every afternoon, she could be found building intricate sandcastles, humming a tune her mother often sang to her. The world, to Jasmine, was one big adventure waiting to be explored. One chilly autumn morning, while the leaves were turning to shades of red and gold, Jasmine was deep in concentration, scooping sand with her tiny hands, fashioning yet another grand castle. The air was crisp, and a few loose strands of hair were tangled around her face as she hummed softly. The scent of fresh earth mixed with the crisp autumn breeze as Jasmine worked, oblivious to everything around her, except for her creations. Across the playground, a boy named Ethan watched her with quiet fascination. Unlike the other children, Ethan was reserved, soft-spoken, and often kept to himself. He wasn't shy, per se. He simply preferred the company of his thoughts and his toy cars. While the other kids were running around or playing in groups, Ethan would often sit at the edge of the playground, building imaginary worlds with his toys or observing the others from a distance. But today, something about Jasmine caught his attention. She seemed different from the other kids, her laughter warmer, her smile brighter, and there was an unspoken confidence about her, as if she belonged in the center of everything. Jasmine wasn't just playing. She was commanding the playground, as if it were her kingdom. Ethan felt a strange pull. For the first time in a long while, he was intrigued. He didn't quite know what it was. Maybe it was the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, or the way she moved so effortlessly, without hesitation. There was something about her that felt both familiar and utterly fascinating. After watching her for a while, Ethan made up his mind. He would talk to her. Gathering all the courage he had, Ethan stood up from his spot on the grass, his favorite red toy car clutched tightly in his hand. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to do something. His tiny footsteps crunched through the fallen leaves as he made his way over to the sandbox where Jasmine was playing. Jasmine, absorbed in her sandcastle construction, didn't notice Ethan approaching. But as he got closer, she looked up, a bit surprised, as if she hadn't expected anyone to come to her. "Hi," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine blinked and smiled, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Hi. What's that you have there?" Ethan glanced down at the red toy car in his hand, a bit self-conscious. "It's my car. I bring it to school every day," he said, his words coming out shy but earnest. "That's so cool," Jasmine exclaimed, her face lighting up. "Can I see it?" Ethan hesitated for just a moment, then knelt down beside her and handed the car to Jasmine. She took it in her small hands, examining it closely. "You know," Jasmine said thoughtfully, "I think you should be my knight." Ethan blinked. "Your knight?" "Yes," Jasmine said, nodding with determination. "Knights are brave. They protect the princess and make sure she has everything she needs. I need a knight to guard my castle." Ethan smiled, a little surprised at her seriousness. "Okay, I can be your knight," he said, his voice growing a little more confident. Jasmine grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "And when I'm older, we'll get married. I'll be the queen, and you'll be my knight, protecting me forever." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't quite understand the concept of marriage. He was only 4 after all. But something in the way Jasmine spoke made him want to agree. It felt like a promise, a vow that belonged to them alone. And somehow, in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'll protect you forever, Jasmine," Ethan said, his words filled with an innocent sincerity. Jasmine beamed. "It's a promise, then," she said, holding out her small hand. "We'll get married when we're grown up." Ethan took her hand, and the two of them sealed the childhood promise with a giggle and a high five. No one around them took it seriously, of course. Who could? It was just a sweet, innocent vow made by two children who didn't yet understand the complexities of life. And so, life went on. The promise made that day in the sandbox was forgotten by the world around them, left to fade away like many childhood promises. But for Ethan and Jasmine, it was a moment of connection, a fleeting memory that would rest quietly in the corners of their minds for years to come. As the seasons changed and the years passed, life took them in different directions. The two friends drifted apart, as children often do, each of them following their own paths. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, fate steps in, and forgotten promises resurface in the most unexpected ways. Little did Ethan know, the promise made in the sandbox would not remain forgotten forever. Paths diverge, memories fade. As the years passed, Ethan and Jasmine moved through their childhoods like two stars orbiting on separate paths. The innocence of their preschool days seemed like a distant memory, fading as the complexity of life began to shape them. Ethan, now 6, was a quiet, thoughtful boy. His world revolved around school, where he excelled academically, and his hobbies, where he immersed himself in things that allowed him to be creative in solitude. Drawing, building with Lego, and playing video games. His parents, loving but a bit overwhelmed by their busy careers, encouraged Ethan to pursue his interests. But they also noticed his tendency to withdraw into his own world. It was as if Ethan was content to observe life rather than fully participate in it. By the time he reached middle school, Ethan had already built walls around himself. He had a small circle of friends, mostly quiet boys who liked the same things he did: video games, comic books, and movies. His academic success came easily to him, but socially he was awkward. He wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention to himself, nor was he the type to stand out in a crowd. He simply existed in the background, a silent observer of life's more chaotic moments. Jasmine, on the other hand, had become a force of nature in her own right. As the years passed, her energy and enthusiasm for life only grew. While she had once been the quiet child in the sandbox, building castles, now she was the girl everyone knew. Her infectious laughter, her bold personality, and her natural ability to make friends made her a popular figure in school. She was outgoing, passionate about art, and loved to perform. From the moment she set foot in elementary school, she became the star of every school play, the lead in every art project, and the heart of every friendship circle. Jasmine's parents, both artists themselves, encouraged her talents and pushed her to always follow her heart. She never seemed to have trouble fitting in. Her vivacity drew people to her, and her warm, caring nature made her the kind of person you could always count on. As they grew older, both Ethan and Jasmine found themselves becoming more absorbed in their own worlds. Their paths never crossed in middle school or high school. Their memories of preschool were buried beneath the weight of new experiences. Ethan's quiet and introspective nature made him an outsider at times, while Jasmine, thriving in the spotlight, seemed to belong to everyone and everything. The promise they had made to each other in the sandbox became just that: something sweet, something childish, forgotten by time, and left behind in the dust of their past. The years sped by, and by the time Ethan reached high school, he had grown into a young man who was more comfortable with his solitude than with the social pressures that seemed to haunt the hallways. He had a few close friends, but for the most part, he kept to himself, content with his books, his music, and his computer. He had grown used to being the quiet one, the observer, the thinker. Jasmine, meanwhile, had blossomed into a confident, outgoing teenager. She was known for her artistic talent and her leadership abilities. She was a star athlete and an award-winning singer. Every year, Jasmine was at the top of her class, balancing her schoolwork, extracurriculars, and social life with ease. Her natural charm made her a beloved figure at school, and she was the kind of person who left a mark on everyone she met. Whether it was through her art, her music, or just her infectious enthusiasm for life, Jasmine had a way of making people feel special. But even as she flourished in so many ways, there was a part of Jasmine that felt a bit lost. Despite her popularity, she often found herself wondering if anyone truly saw her for who she was, beyond the public persona she had carefully crafted. Was there more to her than just the bright, happy, confident girl? Did anyone ever see the vulnerabilities beneath her smile, the quiet doubts that crept into her mind late at night? Jasmine didn't have many answers, but she often found herself thinking back to her childhood. The days when life had seemed simpler, when her biggest concerns were sandcastles and playground games. She sometimes wondered what happened to the quiet, reserved boy named Ethan who had once promised to be her knight. But those thoughts came and went, like fleeting moments of nostalgia. And so, as high school came to an end, Jasmine and Ethan went their separate ways. Their memories of each other were tucked away in the corners of their minds, far from the forefront of their daily lives. Ethan moved to a different city for college, focusing on his studies in engineering, and Jasmine attended a prestigious art school, determined to pursue her passion for the visual arts. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, yet neither of them could have predicted that fate would one day lead them back to each other. Years went by, and as the pressures of adulthood began to weigh heavily on both of them, the paths they had chosen for themselves felt more defined. Ethan was carving out a future in technology, working at a startup company where his skills were highly valued. He had developed a quiet, successful life, his own apartment, a steady job, a few good friends, but still, there was a feeling of emptiness, a sense that something was missing. Jasmine had become a rising star in the art world. She had exhibitions in galleries across the country, and her work was getting noticed by collectors and critics alike. But despite her success, she often found herself wondering if the life she had built was truly her own. She had achieved so much, but something deep inside her longed for connection, for something real, something that went beyond the surface level. In the whirlwind of life, school, career, relationships, they had both lost sight of the promises they once made, of the innocence that had defined their childhood. But destiny has a way of intervening when we least expect it, and sometimes a forgotten promise has a way of coming back to us at the most unexpected time. Little did they know, their story was far from over. It was only just beginning. The unlikely reunion. It was a Saturday afternoon in late autumn when their worlds collided once again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city of Atlanta as Jasmine walked briskly through the bustling streets, her mind occupied with the whirlwind of preparations for her upcoming art exhibition. The gallery was hosting an event featuring some of her latest work, and it had been a stressful few weeks leading up to it. There were last-minute changes to the layout, promotional material to finalize, and endless decisions to be made about which pieces would be featured. But as she navigated the streets, with the familiar hum of the city around her, Jasmine felt the weight of her achievements pressing down on her in a way that was hard to shake. She loved art, of course. She always had. But lately, it felt as though the world she had worked so hard to build around her was becoming suffocating. The expectations, the demands, the constant pressure to perform, it was starting to feel like too much. Somewhere along the way, she had lost the sense of joy that had first inspired her to pick up a paintbrush. What had once been an expression of her innermost self now felt like a career, a hustle, a performance for an audience that never quite saw the real her. As she rounded the corner near her favorite coffee shop, her phone buzzed in her bag, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, and the notification on her screen made her stop in her tracks. Ethan Walker has accepted your connection request. Jasmine blinked at the message, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't seen or heard from Ethan in years. Not since the days when they were children, making promises in the sandbox. She hadn't even thought about him in ages. The last time they'd crossed paths was at the end of elementary school, when they'd both moved on to different middle schools. Since then, their lives had unfolded on separate paths. But here he was, accepting her request on a social networking site she had only recently joined to reconnect with old friends. Jasmine's finger hovered over the notification. Her curiosity piqued. She hadn't reached out to him directly. She hadn't even looked for him. But something about the sudden connection felt almost fateful, like a piece of the past trying to reach her. With a soft laugh, she opened his profile. Ethan's profile picture was simple, just a picture of him standing in front of a city skyline. He looked different than she remembered, of course. Older, more polished, his dark hair a little shorter, and his brown eyes now carrying the weight of adulthood. His smile was smaller than it had been when they were kids, but there was still something familiar about it. It was the same smile she had seen so many years ago, the one that had always been reserved but kind. She clicked on his profile and read the brief bio he had posted. Engineer, innovator, quiet observer of the world, always looking for new perspectives. Jasmine smiled to herself. Ethan had always been like that, thoughtful, introspective, someone who preferred to observe rather than be the center of attention. She had often wondered what had become of him, whether he had grown up to be the kind of person who took risks, or if he had kept to his quiet ways, just as he had when they were kids. Her mind raced, memories of their childhood promises rushing back to her in a wave. She had never expected to hear from him again, and yet here he was, somehow, unexpectedly present in her life. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered sending a message. What would she even say to him after all these years? Hey, remember that time we promised to get married when we grew up? Seemed a bit out of place, to say the least. Before she could overthink it, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification. It was from Ethan. Hey Jasmine, I know it's been a long time, but I couldn't help but think about you. How have you been? Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to message her so soon, or so casually. There was no formal greeting, no awkward attempt to fill the gap of years. It was as if the years didn't exist, just two old friends reaching out, as though time hadn't passed. She smiled, feeling a sudden warmth in her chest. She quickly typed a response. Wow, Ethan. It's been a while. I'm doing well, just staying busy with work. How about you? How's life been treating you? She hit send and waited. The seconds felt like hours, her mind wandering to the memory of that childhood promise. It had always been so innocent, so lighthearted, but somehow it felt like it had been more meaningful than she had given it credit for back then. Maybe it was because, in the years that followed, they had both experienced life in ways that made such promises seem even more precious. Before she could wonder any longer, Ethan's reply came through. It's been good, but honestly, I've always felt like something was missing. I've got a decent job now, and things are going well, but I don't know. It's like there's this part of me that's still stuck back in those days. That promise we made in preschool. Does that sound crazy? I don't know why I'm saying this, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. You were always one of the few people who seemed to understand me. Jasmine stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the mix of emotions flood through her. Ethan had thought about it too. That forgotten promise, the one they had made as children, so innocent and pure, had stayed with him in some way, just as it had stayed with her. It was strange, but comforting. The past they had shared felt so distant, and yet, somehow, it was still a part of them both. With a smile, Jasmine typed her response. Funny you mention that. I was just thinking about those days too. You know, we had no idea what we were talking about back then. But it's funny how sometimes life brings us back to things we forgot. Maybe it wasn't so crazy after all. She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What came next? What was she supposed to say after such an unexpected message, after such an unexpected connection? She decided to be honest, as Ethan had been. "I've been feeling a little lost, to be honest. I love my art, but lately, it's been hard to keep that spark alive. It's like I'm trying to live up to everyone's expectations instead of my own. I guess I've been searching for something real. I don't know if that makes sense." There was a long pause before Ethan replied, but when he did, his message was simple and sincere. "That makes perfect sense. I think I've been searching for something real too. Maybe that's why I reached out. Maybe it's not too late to find it again." Jasmine stared at his words, her heart swelling with a mixture of warmth and uncertainty. What did this mean? Could two people reconnect after so many years and rekindle something that was once so pure, so innocent? Could a promise made in a sandbox, long forgotten, still have the power to bring them back together? There was only one way to find out. "Maybe we should catch up. It's been a long time, but I think we have a lot to talk about." And with that simple invitation, the threads of their past began to weave together once more, pulling them closer than they had ever expected. The promise they made as children, the one that had been buried beneath the weight of years and experience, was no longer a distant memory. It was alive again, a spark in the present, ready to ignite something neither of them could have anticipated. A reunion, unforeseen. Days passed, but the anticipation hung in the air, heavy and palpable. Jasmine couldn't stop thinking about the message exchange with Ethan. The simple words he had sent had stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't realized had been dormant for so long. The familiarity of it, the way he had reached out, so casually yet so thoughtfully, felt both comforting and unnerving at the same time. She had agreed to meet, to reconnect after all these years. But what would that even look like? How could two people who had grown up, changed, and evolved in different directions ever return to the place where they had once made such a silly, sweet promise? Jasmine wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe a quiet coffee, a few laughs about the good old days, and then parting ways, back to their separate lives. Or maybe there was something more to it. The thought made her nervous, excited, and in some ways, deeply curious. The day of their meeting arrived, and Jasmine found herself standing in front of the same coffee shop where she had received the message. The weather had turned cooler in Atlanta, the crisp air mingling with the scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries. She stepped inside, scanning the small cafe for a familiar face, and there he was, Ethan, sitting at a table near the window, quietly watching the world go by. He had grown, of course, taller, more defined, and yet, in that moment, he was the same Ethan who had stood beside her in the sandbox all those years ago, making that ridiculous vow. His brown eyes, though older now, still held the same warmth and quiet understanding she remembered. He wasn't quite the shy boy she had known, but there was still something reserved about him, something that made him seem like he was content simply observing life from a distance. Ethan looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a smile that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. He stood up, as if caught off guard by his own emotions. "Jasmine," he said softly, almost as if he couldn't quite believe she was there. "Ethan," she replied, her voice betraying the excitement she felt, though she tried to mask it with a calm smile. "It's good to see you." He smiled sheepishly and gestured for her to sit. "Yeah, it feels surreal, doesn't it?" He sat back down across from her, his hands fidgeting slightly on the table. Jasmine sat down, the soft hum of the cafe around them suddenly feeling distant. They had so much to say, and yet the silence stretched on for a few moments as they both tried to find their bearings. How do you pick up a conversation after so many years? After so much life had passed? "So, I guess we should start with the obvious," Jasmine said, breaking the silence. "You're not the shy little boy I remember." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound warm and easy. "I suppose not. I'm still not exactly a social butterfly, but I've learned to get by." "Good to know I'm not the only one who's still awkward," Jasmine said, laughing lightly. She hadn't expected to feel this comfortable with him so quickly, but there was something about him, something familiar and reassuring, that made it easy to slip into conversation. They talked for hours, catching up on everything they had missed in each other's lives. Ethan spoke about his work in engineering, how he had started at a tech startup after finishing his degree, and how the fast-paced environment had pushed him to grow, but also left him feeling disconnected from everything else. Jasmine shared her journey in the art world, the highs and lows of her career, and how the recognition she had achieved sometimes felt hollow, as if the applause from the outside world couldn't fill the emptiness she often felt inside. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before they knew it, the afternoon had slipped into evening. The sun had long since set, the streetlights outside casting a soft glow through the windows. "So," Jasmine said, leaning back in her chair, a playful glint in her eye, "I have to ask, have you been keeping track of me all these years? You just happened to accept my connection request at the perfect time." Ethan smiled, though there was a hint of nervousness behind his eyes. "Honestly, not really. It's more like, I don't know. A few weeks ago, I was thinking about the past, and then I saw you pop up on my feed. Something about it just felt right. I don't know if that sounds strange." "No, it doesn't sound strange at all," Jasmine said, her voice gentle. "It's just surprising. I mean, after all this time, I never expected to hear from you again, let alone talk like this." There was a brief silence between them, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was as if they were both grappling with the reality of the moment, the unexpectedness of it, how life had brought them back together, years after they had lost touch. "What made you reach out?" Jasmine asked, her voice soft. "You said you were thinking about the past. What brought that on?" Ethan looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. There was a long pause before he answered, as if he were carefully choosing his words. I think I've been searching for something," he said slowly. "I've been feeling kind of disconnected from everything, you know. I've worked hard to build this life. Good job, decent career, all that. But there's something missing. I guess I've been chasing something for so long that I didn't even realize what I was looking for until I saw your name again." Jasmine nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened. It was like hearing a part of herself echoed back to her. She had been feeling the same way. Success, achievement, recognition, none of it seemed to fill the void she had been trying to ignore. "I get that," she said quietly. "I think I've been chasing something too. I love what I do, but I feel like I've lost the joy that came with it. I've been so focused on getting it right that I've forgotten why I started in the first place. I've been searching for meaning, and I'm not sure where to find it anymore." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. It was strange how the simplest things, an old promise, a chance connection, could bring so much clarity to a person's life. "Do you think," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that some things are just meant to come full circle? Like maybe we're supposed to find each other again. Maybe the promise we made as kids wasn't just a silly thing after all." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had been thinking the same thing, but to hear him say it aloud made everything feel real. "You mean the promise we made to each other?" she asked, her voice quiet, tentative. Ethan met her gaze, his brown eyes serious yet filled with a glimmer of something unspoken. "I think it was more than just a promise. I think it was a sign that we were meant to find each other, even if we didn't know it at the time." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of emotions rising inside her. It had been so long since anyone had understood her this deeply, this simply. And here was Ethan, the boy who had made her a promise all those years ago, saying that maybe they were meant to fulfill it, not as children, but as two people who had lived, grown, and learned what it meant to truly love life, and perhaps each other, again. She smiled, her heart swelling with a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. "Maybe it wasn't so silly after all," she said softly. "Maybe we were meant to keep that promise. And maybe, It's time we started to see where it leads. A new beginning. The weeks that followed their reunion felt like a quiet unraveling of time, each moment drawing Jasmine and Ethan closer together, weaving the threads of their past into something entirely new. Their initial meeting had sparked something neither of them could easily name, but they both knew it was important. The promise they had made as children, once nothing more than a playful declaration in the sandbox, now felt like a seed planted in their hearts, a seed that had begun to sprout into something real. Ethan and Jasmine continued to meet regularly. What had started as casual coffee dates quickly turned into long walks through the city, dinners at quiet restaurants, and late-night talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning. The more they shared with each other, the more they realized how much they had in common despite the years of distance. They had both taken different paths. Ethan into the structured, fast-paced world of technology, Jasmine into the free-flowing, often unpredictable world of art. But at their core, they were still the same people who had once made a promise on the playground. As they spent more time together, it became clear that they both felt a sense of unfinished business between them, a feeling that the promise they had made as children was not just an innocent fantasy, but something deeper, something that had followed them into adulthood, waiting to be realized. There was an undeniable chemistry between them now, a magnetism that was impossible to ignore. What had once been a lighthearted childhood vow now seemed like a call to something greater, something more meaningful than either of them could have anticipated. One evening, as the first hints of winter began to settle over Atlanta, Ethan suggested they take a trip to the mountains. He had a small cabin in the Appalachian foothills, a place he had retreated to many times over the years when life felt too overwhelming. He had always gone there alone, finding solace in the quiet of nature, but now he couldn't imagine going without Jasmine. Jasmine hesitated at first. She was always so focused on her art, her exhibitions, and the expectations that came with them. But something about the invitation felt right. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that she needed a break, that she needed to disconnect from the whirlwind of her life in the city. The idea of spending a weekend in a cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and the crisp mountain air, seemed like the perfect escape. So, they packed their bags and set off for the mountains. The drive was long but peaceful, the landscape changing from the busy streets of Atlanta to the quiet open roads leading to the foothills. As they reached the cabin, nestled among towering pine trees, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over her. The air was fresh, crisp with the scent of pine and earth. The silence of the mountains was a sharp contrast to the constant noise of the city, and for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt like she could breathe. The cabin itself was small and simple, but cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and wide windows looked out onto the forest. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. They spent the evening by the fire, cooking dinner together, talking about everything and nothing. There was no rush, no deadlines, no obligations, just the two of them, reconnecting, rediscovering the comfort of each other's presence. As they sat by the fire, sipping their drinks and watching the flames dance, Ethan broke the silence. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low but steady, "I've been thinking about what we talked about that promise, about how we're both searching for something real. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I know that being here with you feels different than anything I've ever experienced. It's like we're finally being honest with ourselves." Jasmine looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The crackling of the fire filled the silence between them, but she didn't need words to understand what Ethan was trying to say. She had felt it too. The pull between them, the magnetic connection that seemed to transcend time and distance. "I feel the same way," she said softly. "I never expected any of this. It feels surreal, but also right, in a way I can't explain. I've been so caught up in the world I've built for myself, in my art, my career, that I forgot about the things that really matter." But now with you, it's like I'm remembering what it means to live without all the noise. To just be. Ethan reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. Maybe that's what we were always meant to do, to find each other again, to remember what we were like before the world told us who we should be. Maybe that promise we made wasn't just about getting married one day. Maybe it was about finding each other when we were ready, when we could finally be who we were always meant to be. Jasmine's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words. She had never been good at letting go of control, at trusting the flow of life. She had always been the one to chase, to strive, to make sure everything was perfect. But with Ethan, she felt a sense of peace, as if she didn't have to carry the burden of the world on her shoulders anymore. She could simply be. "Do you think it's too late?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "No, I don't think it's ever too late. If anything, I think we've only just begun." The word hung in the air between them, a promise renewed, a new beginning unfolding. Jasmine felt her heart swell with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. She had always believed in the power of art, of creating something from nothing, of finding beauty in the chaos of life. But now, for the first time, she believed in the power of love, of real connection, of shared history, of the possibility that sometimes life gives you second chances. The night wore on, but neither of them wanted to sleep. They talked until the fire burned low, exchanging stories and dreams, fears and desires, letting their hearts open in a way they hadn't in years. By the time they finally went to bed, the room was bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace, and the mountains outside stood silent, guarding their quiet promise. In the days that followed, the simplicity of their time together in the cabin left an indelible mark on them both. They didn't need grand gestures or sweeping declarations. What they had was enough. It was real. It was honest. And it was theirs. When they returned to Atlanta, the world felt a little different, as if the noise and rush of life had faded just a little, leaving space for something new. Jasmine continued her work, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She found herself painting again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Ethan, too, found himself more grounded, his work no longer feeling like a constant race, but more like a reflection of his true self. They didn't rush into anything. They knew that some promises take time to fulfill, and some love stories unfold slowly, over years, and not in a single moment. But they were content, knowing that whatever path lay ahead, they were walking it together. And as they walked forward, hand in hand, they realized that the promise they'd made as children was never really about getting married. It was about finding each other when the time was right. And now, it seemed the time had come. The promise fulfilled. It had been months since that weekend in the mountains, and life for both Ethan and Jasmine had taken on a new rhythm, a quiet kind of harmony. The initial rush of their reunion, the whirlwind of emotions, the rediscovery of each other, it had all settled into something deeper, something more lasting. But even in the calm, there was a constant, undeniable pull between them, as though life had nudged them back together, not just for a fleeting moment, but for something more profound, something worth waiting for. Jasmine's art had flourished in ways she hadn't expected. She found herself painting more freely, her brushstrokes filled with a rawness that hadn't been there before. She began to embrace the imperfections, the messy, beautiful process of creating, instead of the polished, perfect end result that she had been so fixated on. Her gallery showings had grown in stature, attracting attention from collectors and critics alike. But more than the accolades, it was the joy she felt when she painted that made her heart full. It was as if she had found the freedom she had been missing, the kind of freedom that allowed her to be herself, without compromise. And then there was Ethan. His work at the tech company had grown more fulfilling too, though he had never been the type to chase success for its own sake. As the months passed, he found himself gravitating toward projects that aligned more closely with his values. He started mentoring younger engineers, sharing his knowledge not just about the technical aspects of the field, but about the human side of innovation, the importance of creativity, collaboration, and the ways in which technology could be used to make a positive impact on the world. He was no longer driven by the pressure to climb the corporate ladder, but by the desire to create something meaningful, something that resonated with him on a personal level. In the quiet moments between their busy lives, they continued to grow closer. They took walks in the park, spent evenings cooking together, and shared their hopes and fears with one another. There was no rush, no pressure to define what they were or where they were headed. They simply enjoyed each other's company, knowing that whatever came next would unfold in its own time. But even in this peaceful rhythm, the question of that childhood promise lingered in the back of their minds. The promise that they had made so innocently, so spontaneously, when they were just kids. It had never really been about getting married, of course. They both knew that. It was about something deeper, a connection that transcended time and distance, a bond that had always been there, waiting for them to rediscover it when they were ready. The question, however, remained, were they ready? One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light over the city, Ethan took Jasmine by the hand and led her to a small park near her apartment. It was a place they had walked through many times, but tonight it felt different. The air was cool, and the streets were quieter than usual. The world around them seemed to have slowed down, as though holding its breath, waiting for something. "Jasmine," Ethan began, his voice a little uncertain, but steady. "There's something I've been thinking about, something that's been on my mind for a while now." Jasmine turned to him, her heart suddenly racing, though she couldn't say why. "What is it?" He paused for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts, then turned to face her fully. His eyes were searching, as if he were trying to find the right words, the ones that could encapsulate everything he was feeling. "I know we've both been carrying that promise we made as kids," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "We've talked about it, but I think I've come to understand something important. That promise wasn't about a specific day or event. It wasn't about a moment we were supposed to fulfill. It was about this, about us, about finding each other, about choosing each other, no matter how much time has passed. And I don't think that's something you can plan for. It's something you just know when it happens." Jasmine felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart beating faster. She had known, of course, that this moment might come, but hearing him say it aloud, the words so simple, so profound, it was like a light flickering on in the depths of her soul. She had spent so much of her life trying to control every detail, trying to make things perfect, trying to chase after dreams that felt distant and out of reach. But in that moment, standing before Ethan, she realized that the thing she had always been searching for wasn't somewhere out there, in the future. It was right here, in front of her, in the love they had built together. "I know what you mean," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about it too. That promise, it was never about an exact moment. It was about this feeling, about the way we're here together, in the present. We've both been through so much, and we've both changed so much, but we're still us. And that's what matters." Ethan took a step closer to her, his hand reaching up to gently cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, and Jasmine felt a sense of peace wash over her as she looked into his eyes. The world around them seemed to disappear, as though there was only the two of them, standing in this moment, this quiet understanding. "Jasmine," Ethan said, his voice low and sincere, "I don't need a grand gesture. I don't need a proposal with a ring or a wedding with all the bells and whistles. What I need, what I've always needed, is you. You've been there with me through all of it, through the silence, through the chaos, through the waiting. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to be apart from you anymore. Will you be with me? Not because of a promise we made as kids, but because we've built something real here together." Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes as she took a deep breath, her heart full to the brim with emotions she hadn't known how to express until now. It wasn't about the past, about the promise they had made in preschool. It was about the love they had cultivated, the life they had created together, one step at a time, over the months and years. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain, despite the emotions that swirled within her. "Yes, I will. I don't need anything more than this, Ethan. Just you, just us." With those words, the promise they had made all those years ago, in a sandbox so far removed from their adult lives, was finally fulfilled. Not with a wedding or a ceremony, but with the quiet certainty that they had found each other again, not just as children, but as two people who had lived, loved, and grown together. And that was more than enough. As they stood there, in the fading light of the evening, hand in hand, Jasmine knew one thing for certain. The promise they had made as children had led them to this moment, not because they had to fulfill it, but because it had always been a symbol of what was meant to be. And now, they were living it, together.